Hi, I'm Jeanette Sloan. I've worked as a textile designer for over 25 years. Over that time, my work has evolved and it's taken me in lots of different and interesting directions. So while some of you will know me only as a hand knitter, others will know me for my work writing about BIPOC representation and as founder of BIPOC In Fiber. In fact, since I first graduated from art college in 1990, I've been a technician, a tutor, a designer maker, a freelance textile designer, yarn shop owner, author, magazine columnist, and, I guess, public speaker. I first visited Perth Festival of Yarn in 2019 when I was asked to deliver a number of classes and the keynote lecture. Fast forward 12 months and we're living in a very, very different world, with many of us having to rely on virtual communications to stay in contact with our communities. So when I was asked to deliver a talk at this year's Perth Festival of Yarn, I thought it would be interesting to look back over my creative journey and to see how it's brought me to where I am now. I think the thing that set me on my creative path was my family. My parents came over from Barbados. They came over to the UK at the beginning of 1960 actually. They're from Barbados, both of them are from Barbados, and they never worked as professional craftspeople, but they very much had, or instilled in me, a real longing for making things. So I think that crafting was certainly in my heritage or in my DNA. I never knew my paternal grandparents. I only met my paternal grandmother once, but my mum told me that her father, Eustace, he used to hand make furniture and she used to help him. My mum used to crochet, she used to tat, and she used to sew when they were in Barbados. So there's a real strong tradition of making there, because back in those days, if you didn't have something, you couldn't simply, you had to turn to your hand skills to find out how to make something. I think we're very spoiled now. So I would say that there was a very strong tradition of crafting on my mother's side. On my dad's side, he was incredibly gifted as a craftsperson. Again, he didn't do it as a profession. He was actually eventually came over to this country and became an electrician. But in Barbados, he used to make shoes for my mum. According to her, he used to get the shoe catalogues from America and copy the styles because they couldn't afford them. And he would make shoes for my mum that apparently other women were very jealous of. So again, there's that strong tradition of making things with your hands. So when they both came over from Barbados to the UK, Mum learned to knit from my godmother, Winnie, because she wanted to be able to design her own knitwear, and she wanted to primarily make clothes for us as kids and the family. She learned how to knit because she wanted to be able to tweak the design. She always put her own little design twist on things. So when I was growing up, I was used to Mum knitting and sewing and crocheting things for us. Dad would make furniture. He didn't make shoes, as far as I can remember when we were kids. He never made shoes for us, but he would make furniture. And in fact, it was back in the 70s when central heating wasn't particularly common, but he put the central heating in our house. He learned how to do it, and which I bet you couldn't do now, but he learned to do that. So there's a real strong tradition of making things with your hands and doing them to a really high standard in my family. The person who really encouraged me to draw was my brother, my older brother Wayne, who is 5 years older than me, and he was the most amazing artist. In the 70s, when I was growing up, he was really into Marvel Comics, and I remember him copying things out of Marvel Comics and drawing massive murals on his bedroom wall. And in particular, I remember an old handbag of Mum's that she had given to me, and he drew Scamp, I think from Lady and the Tramp. Is that a Disney character? He drew that on a bag for me, and I absolutely loved it. So as a kid I could draw, but it was my brother that really encouraged me to explore drawing. But I would make clothes for my dolls. I learned to knit. My mum taught me my mum taught me to knit when I was 7. Because I wanted to be like her. She was the most incredibly graceful and gifted knitter, and it just looked like magic when she knitted. It was just, she held her needles really beautifully. She was very ever so elegant, and she was quick, so I wanted to be like my mum. So she taught me to knit, and I would make scarves for my toys, and I just wanted to be like my mum, but I didn't think that it would be something that I would still be doing 25 years later. At junior school, having been kind of given the drawing bug by my brother, I loved art when I was a kid at school. So I would draw everywhere, and I would join the art club at school. I remember being in the batik club, and we would stay after school and just explore the technique of batik. And then as I got older and went through my older qualifications, my A-levels, it was art and printmaking that I really, really loved. That was the thing that seemed to take over. So I think from around the age of 14, 15, I knew that art was going to feature in my future plans as a career. So I'm going to try and keep this kind of quite light, because the last thing you need is to hear me droning on and on about my life's history. So I began my education doing a diploma in textiles. And I tend to say that I'm a textile designer rather than a knitwear designer, and you'll see why as you see the kind of work that I was doing then. It was a diploma back in the days of BTEC diplomas, and I loved it. It was at a place called Amersham College in Buckinghamshire, and it was an incredibly good high level of teaching. Some amazing tutors, one of whom now runs a company called Quinton Chadwick, so a little name check. Jane Chadwick, thank you for all the pearls of wisdom you gave me back then. And I absolutely loved it. It was a fantastic course, very, very small. There were only 7 of us specialising in knit. And I, back then, combined my love of hand knitting, which I was still hand knitting, with machine knitting, which I'd never done before. And I would do a little bit of hand embroidery. But it was 2 of the best years of my life, even though it came at a slightly strange time, because between my first and second years at my course, I was diagnosed with cancer. So that almost put the blocks on what I was doing. But then I decided at the time that I was just stay at college and carry on studying, and then kind of fit in the treatment around it. So the only reason I mention that is because that did kind of dictate the path of what happened next. So on my BTEC HND, I came for the first time to machine knitting, and I didn't take to it immediately. I found it incredibly frustrating, as I think a lot of new machine knitters do, things dropping off when you don't expect them to, and yarns getting tangled in hair when I had hair. But I found that I kind of gradually came to it, and I found ways of incorporating my hand knitting, which I was still doing at the time, with machine knitting, and that's what made me want to take knitting up as opposed to print. It was something that I suppose that mixture of texture and the tactile qualities of working with yarn, and being able to translate something from a 2-dimensional idea into something 3-dimensional in a pretty short amount of time, really, really appealed to me, and it really excited me. So I specialised in knit, and I then went on to become a technician actually it was the same course initially. It moved institution to a place in university in High Wycombe, and became a degree. So I went from being a student, graduated, and then became a technician on the course, which I loved, because at that stage I was really interested in solving technical problems with, you know, knitting machines and hand knitting. So that really did suit me, and I really got a buzz from teaching students the, you know, the basics of machine knitting, and then helping them to sort of upskill, and also incorporating what I learned by teaching them into my own work. It was while working on the degree course as a technician that I came to machine embroidery. It was never something that I had tried before, but they had the most wonderful Benina machines, which had a great kind of function where you could just twist the dial and it would give, you could do really beautiful free embroidery and vary the width of the stitch. And I found that was like drawing, being able to just draw with thread. So that I'm going to just put up a couple of slides and you can see some of the work that I was doing then when I was on my final year of my degree while I was working. So I'd already done a BTEC HND, started working as a technician, and then had the opportunity to do a top-up year to translate that into a degree. So while doing that, I was really into embroidery and almost making yarn. So these boards will show you a couple of the ideas that I'd had playing around with making yarns on an overlocker. So just grabbing different yarns, things like raffia and linen and wool, and feeding them into an overlocker to produce sort of fringes and yarns. So I was kind of playing very much with texture, and almost it was more like constructed textiles then. And these kind of gave me ideas for knitwear designs. I think it's quite telling that there is hardly any knit on this board. This was an initial ideas board, and I've come to realise over the years that I'm not particularly sentimental about my work, because there is very, very little knit in my archive. I've got a lot of embroidery and a lot of paper designs and a lot of photographs, but not a lot of knit, and actually that's a real shame. So one thing I would say that Lorna Howelter Brown is always telling me, you need to keep an archive, because I'm realising now how important that archive is, because very little of my work still exists. Another thing I did throughout these 9 years working at Bucks College was I worked as a freelance knitwear designer. And this is, I think in all reflection, it's a slightly strange kind of job, or it was back then. There was no fast fashion, so fast fashion didn't exist. Seasons were very much dictated by trends, and people tended to stick to those trends. And so we used those trend boards to produce collections of designs that agents would take out to places like the States and Japan and sell to big fashion brands or manufacturing companies. And they would take those ideas and use them. So there was no you didn't have any copyright. What your job was to produce swatches that they could get a lot of ideas from. So there's a saying in England where you kind of got everything but the kitchen sink. You basically throw a lot of ideas at a swatch, and then they can basically cherry pick what they want from those designs. So although a lot of these, and I'm going to show you some of them in a second, may look a little bit gaudy. Remember, this was the 90s. And these wouldn't all have gone into one design. These would have supplied whoever bought them with a number of ideas. So there was generally always a trim on the end of the swatch, a couple of stitch ideas. I tended to add embroidery because that was just my thing. I would add embroidery, I would add beading. And, you know, sometimes that was just proved to be far too expensive for manufacturers to then produce, or it would kind of give them enough ideas for perhaps an embroidery on one line or one design, knitting on another design. But the other thing that I did was I also did embroidery. So having learnt to use the machines, the Benina machines in my job as a technician, I then took that into my designing job as a freelance designer, and I would do that not only onto my knits, but then I started doing embroidery designs in themselves. So some of them were onto just fabrics that I would buy, but also some of them were onto fabrics that I would then use the print process of devour or burnout. So it's a paste where you put it onto some fabric that's a mixture of a synthetic and a natural fibre, and it burns out the natural fibre and leaves the synthetic fabric at the back. So I can show you a couple of these samples here now. So this is a silk viscose I think silk viscose satin, and you can see it's kind of quite transparent, and there's a close-up in the slides. This has got a lot of embroidery on it, so they've just got a little, almost like a little undulating devore pattern that just winds down, and then the embroidery in between. So you've kind of got like a sort of transparency or semi-transparent fabric. Here's another one. So, and that's just got a really beautiful drape to it. So this was one collection of designs that I did. And a lot of this wasn't even done with the screen. I think it was just painted on, and then you had to be very careful not to paint on too much of it, because it would literally, when you were ironing it, then you'd paint the paste on or screen print the paste on, and then either bake it, or I used to iron it on the back with an iron until the paste turned brown, and then just rub it, and the devore paste would fall away and leave these kind of sheer areas in the fabric. So that was part of a devore embroidery collection that I did. Now these samples are on silk viscose georgette, if I remember, or silk georgette, if I remember rightly. And this is embroidery, machine embroidery at the centre, and tambour beading. Back to my mum. My mum used to do sewing classes. She went to sewing classes after she retired. So she was a nurse for around 25, 30 years. And after she retired, she started taking sewing classes. And one day she asked me whether I fancied going along to do a beading class. And I thought it was just kind of the sort of typical sort of beading. But actually it's tambour beading. And tambour beading, I was taught to do tambour beading on a frame. So the fabric is stretched on almost like a tapestry frame, got like two rollers, and then it's stretched and it's tensioned so that because the applying the beads pulls in, so it's tensioned on all sides. And then this particular tutor, I think her name was Janet, taught us how to do it. But you string beads onto sewing thread, and the beads are applied from underneath, and with the fabric tensioned horizontally, you go through the top like this, and basically it's almost like using a crochet chain action to go through the fabric, pick up the thread with a bead attached, and then pull it through, and then make a chain on the background, and then go back down and pick up another bead. So that's how I applied these beads to this georgette fabric, which gives it a really beautiful weight. And anybody who knows me now knows how I love a little bit of bling. So that's how this was applied. And I can't begin to imagine how long this would have taken me back when I did this sample. But the centre bit was embroidered, machine embroidered. Once again, that's the free embroidery technique on a Bernina sewing machine. And this was all tambour beaded on afterwards. And that's there. And obviously, I didn't sell this because it would have been far too expensive to produce at the time. Here's another sample on georgette, silk georgette, and that's got a really much more subtle embroidery pattern on it with just a little bit of beading on it. But it's funny how over the years you kind of do things and then just kind of put them away and forget about them. So when I was I was actually thinking about last year, I was looking back through just a box of samples that I had and couldn't actually believe that I'd sat and done this. But if I did see it as a sample, I would definitely buy a garment that had that on it, because you can't beat a bit of bling. In 1989, I took the opportunity to move north of the border to the Scottish town of Galashiels to do a master's. The title of the course was a Master of Design in Textiles with Computer Applications. And it was, with the benefit of hindsight, it was a slightly strange time. I haven't actually looked at that work for a very, very long time. In fact, not really since I left. And it wasn't the course for me, actually. Thinking back on it, the kind of work that I was doing then, while some of it was kind of influenced by the work that I'd been doing up to then, it's strange to look at it now because it's really lacking that punchy colour and I guess what's become my real design signature in terms of rich embellishment and a real sort of textural joy. It seems to be lacking in textural joy, and for one reason or another I just didn't really find my feet there, which is a shame really. As you'll see from some of the samples that I'm going to show you, on one of the projects I actually stripped the colour right back, so it's almost a totally neutral palette. And I was working with just a lot of ecru yarn, some of it sampling, but there was just the tiniest injection of colour, which seems so unlike me now. But on the other hand, there was some work that I did that was very, very rich in colour and very much like the sort of embroidery work that I'd done previously when I was at Bucks. So I'll just show you a couple of the samples from that collection. These are some of the embroideries that I was doing then. These are on to shot taffeta, so still working with dissolvable fabric or dissolvable medium. And I was looking at using decoration as a means of joining sections of fabric together. So this is a piece of taffeta that's had some of the warp taken out of it, or one direction of the fibre taken out of the actual fabric, so that it just reveals almost like a sort of sheer ladder in part of the fabric, and then using embroidery to join two sections together. So this is all free embroidery, once again done on a Bernina machine, because by this stage I had my own machine. And there's another couple of samples here where I'm just cutting sections out of the fabric and then making a feature of that sort of use of sort of negative space within the embroidery, and also using embroidery as a feature on things like trims and edges. And again, removing the warp and the weft after sections of the fabric have been embroidered into. So almost like creating a decorative window within the fabric. And again here, it's removing some of the warp or the weft just to give slightly sheer lines. Also I explored the idea of kind of hidden decoration. So this was an idea for a skirt sample, so that when the garment was being worn or there was movement while wearing the garment, you could actually see, if I tip it towards the light, you can see. So that's just like a whole concealed section of embroidery that's within the pleat. And then there's embroidery that just runs across the bottom of the garment. In terms of knitting, I was working on a machine that I seem to remember was called a Lynx machine, although I could be wrong. This was a machine that had, rather than having two beds that were positioned like that, which you would have on a machine like a Dubier, a hand flat machine, these needle beds were actually horizontal and one facing opposite the other. So they would, if you were standing at the machine, you would face like that, but there was only one set of needles, and this machine would produce, it could produce garter stitch because the needles travelled from front to back, and there was a lever that you could select. You could do needle selection by pushing the needles forward and then swinging the handle. It's really vague, my memory is so bad. But this created a fabric that looked like reverse stocking stitch, but then you would get occasional, these actually look like tuck stitches down the front, and that's by just throwing the lever and doing needle selection on the front bed. So this fabric was created by first of all starting with I think this is a 3 or 4 coloured double bed jacquard, or double bed jacquard on a domestic machine, and then transferring that onto this, we'll call it the Lynx machine, unless someone can correct me, you're welcome to, and then transferring it onto the single bed of a Lynx machine, and then working with that machine to create linear textural effects. And also the stripes are created by working alternating and creating stripes with a viscose yarn and a very fine wool yarn. So that's what gives that sort of sheer and opaque horizontal stripes that's working with the vertical stripes of the, actually you can see it there, that's a little bit better, with the vertical stripes of the sort of tuck garter. It's almost like a tuck garter stitch. Here's another sample from that time. Again, this is a, let's have a look, I think that's 1, 2, 3, 4. That's actually a 5 coloured, 5 colours in a row double bed jacquard, which I was really into then, trying to get as many colours in one single row, or in 2 rows of patterning on a domestic knitting machine. So lots of the detail was there, and then the pattern, the sample would go up into very simple stripes that were worked regularly. So these are 2 row stripes of a very fine viscose, 2 colours of viscose and a wool. And again, this is on that same machine. So while you've got areas of, if I actually turn it that way, there you go, that's great, you can see it there. So you've got areas where there's reverse stocking stitch there, that's the purl side. And then you've got areas here where you've got that kind of vertical linear sort of tuckle garter stitch texture. Another of the projects that I worked on while I was at Gala was a design competition for a cashmere company. So the brief was basically, I think it was to just create a garment that was to be made in, I think it was either silk or cashmere, because I seem to remember the garment that I'm about to show you being knitted in silk. And that garment was knitted on one of the big Shimaseki powered machines, but it was based on a sample that I had developed, or that on one of the Dubier machines. So Dubier is a flat bed, V bed, so the beds are positioned like that, knitting machine. And I think this is, I'm not quite sure what gauge this is. It's about, actually I think this is 10 gauge. So that's it there. You can see there are lots and lots of floats running across the fabric, and then the floats are running there, and then here it's got areas where certain needles are knitting more often than the ones on either side. So it's almost creating this sort of pin tuck or a very subtle ripple effect. So that was the fabric that I then had went to one of the technicians and developed for the garment that you can see in the slide. I really remember that being a huge problem to knit that fabric off the, to get it off the Shima machine, because if the floats became too bulky, or if there was a knot in one of the yarns, then it would periodically kind of snap and the machine would stop, or it would just press off or drop off the machine. So, and those garment panels are actually quite long. So it was interesting just sitting there watching and praying that this thing was going to knit without any holes in it. Otherwise we had to start again. And of course, with it being a competition and it was silk that I was working with, there wasn't a kind of a bottomless pit of silk to be worked with. We had a finite amount of yarn and a finite amount of time, and it was just sitting there watching almost every row knit, and just when a piece came off and it was successful, there weren't any flaws in it or holes in it, we could use it. So that was, I think there were 2 wide garment panels that created that coat that were then cut down the center, and those cut lines became the side seams, and the side edges became the front opening edges. So it was really important to keep an eye on the side edges of that fabric, because they were going to be the bits that were immediately in the line of sight when the garment was worn, either the front, or as you can see from the back view of this garment, rather than having a centre back seam, the garment was actually split at the back as well. So it's just the sort of trim around the neckline that's almost holding the shoulders and the neck of that together. So whilst it looks like quite a sort of sober, classic looking garment, it's got that kind of slightly sexy edge to it in that the back seam is actually open. So it was nice because it just revealed whatever was being worn underneath. In this case, nothing, because Lisa, the model, wasn't wearing anything. And it was very, very simple silhouette, but it was all about showcasing the beautiful silk yarn because it had an amazing drape, and the technique, which I was really, really pleased at the way that it looked, because it was very, very subtle two-colour ecru and just a slightly sort of creamy buttery colour in the silk that was running through. What's been fun about looking back over the last 20 plus years is that I found jobs that I had totally forgotten that I'd done, and this is another one of those occasions. I worked with the knitwear label Cameron Taylor in Edinburgh on their collections, on their knitwear collections, hand knitwear collections I should say, for a couple of seasons during 2009. And this picture shows a couple of the garments that I was responsible for translating into patterns and actually getting produced by hand knitters. So at the time I would get a sketch with some dimensions and an idea of the stitch patterns, and my job was to translate those sketches into an actual garment. So I did that for this sort of mermaid sleeved garment, and for this little lace waistcoat. Just wanted to say thank you, Eva, for inviting me to give this talk. It's been really interesting looking back over the past 25 plus years. A lot of the work I'd actually forgotten about, but it's actually got me quite excited and quite inspired to see how I can bring a lot of those creative memories back into the work that I do in the future. Take care.